Jiwoo sat at her metal desk in the research lab, staring at the blank screen of her datapad. Outside the reinforced glass walls, the purple sky of Krathvar stretched endlessly, dotted with 3 small moons. She had been on this alien world for 6 months now, studying creatures that most humans would call monsters. But Jiwoo knew better. The Krath were not monsters. They were intelligent, curious, and surprisingly gentle when they wanted to be. She picked up her stylus and began to write her daily to-do list. It was a habit from Earth, something her mother had taught her when she was young. Every morning, write down what you need to do. Every evening, look at what you finished. It kept her organized. It kept her sane. Morning exercise, she wrote first. Check cub health status, water the plants, organize sample containers, submit daily report. Simple tasks, easy tasks. Tasks that made her feel like she had control over something in this strange place, far from home. In the corner of the lab, 3 pairs of amber eyes watched her. The cubs had been awake for an hour already, but they stayed quiet in their observation area. Talon, the largest of the 3, had scales like polished black stone. Ember was smaller, with a reddish tint to her dark scales that caught the light. Shadow, the youngest, was the darkest of them all, with eyes that seemed to glow in dim light. Jiwoo glanced at them and smiled. "Good morning, little ones," she said softly. They chirped back at her, a sound that most people would find terrifying, but that she found oddly comforting. The Krath were apex predators on this world. Adults could tear through steel with their claws and hunt in packs with frightening intelligence, but these 3 were just babies, barely 4 months old. They had been brought to the research station after their mother died in a rock slide. She set down her datapad and stood up, stretching her arms above her head. Time for morning exercise. She had a small space cleared in the corner of the lab where she could do basic stretches and movements. It was important to stay active, especially on a station where most people spent their days sitting at computers. As she moved through her routine, she noticed the cubs watching her more intently than usual, their heads tilted in unison, following her movements. When she finished and walked back to her desk, all 3 of them made a soft purring sound. She had never heard them do that before. Jiwoo picked up her datapad and looked at her list. With her stylus, she drew a line through morning exercise. There, 1 task done. It felt good, as it always did. The cubs suddenly became very excited. They stood up in their enclosure, pressing against the clear barrier that separated them from the rest of the lab. Their eyes were fixed on her datapad. Talon made a clicking sound and pawed at the barrier. "What is it?" Jiwoo asked, walking over to them. "Are you hungry? It is not feeding time yet." But they were not looking at her. They were looking at the datapad in her hand. Specifically, they were looking at the screen where she had just crossed off her first task. "This?" she asked, holding it up. "My to-do list!" Talon chirped loudly. Ember and Shadow joined in, creating a chorus of sounds that made Jiwoo laugh. She had no idea what they were trying to tell her, but they clearly found something interesting about what she was doing. She shook her head and went back to work. The cubs needed their morning health check. She put on her protective gloves and opened the small access door in their enclosure. One by one, she examined them. Talon was growing faster than the others. Ember had a small scratch on her front leg that was healing well. Shadow seemed perfectly healthy, though he was still smaller than his siblings. After the check, Jiwoo filled out the data on her computer. The cubs settled down and began playing with the enrichment toys she had placed in their area. Everything seemed normal. She spent the next hour watering the small plants she kept in the lab and organizing her sample containers. The work was peaceful and mindless, giving her time to think about her upcoming reports. At noon, she would need to send her daily observations to the research team back on Earth. When she finished organizing, she sat down at her desk again and looked at her list. Time to check off 2 more tasks. She drew lines through water the plants and organize sample containers. Only one task left for the morning: submit the daily report. As she worked on the report, she heard a strange scratching sound behind her. She turned around and gasped. Talon had somehow opened the access door from inside the enclosure. He was dragging something across the lab floor with his teeth. It was her running shoe. "Talon, how did you get out?" Jiwoo stood up quickly, but she was not afraid. She had spent enough time with the cubs to know they would not hurt her. But this was new behavior. Concerning behavior. Talon dropped the shoe at her feet and sat back on his haunches, looking up at her with those bright amber eyes. He chirped once, then looked at her datapad on the desk, then back at her, then at the datapad again. Jiwoo slowly understood. She picked up the shoe and looked at her to-do list. Morning exercise was already crossed off, but the shoe was her exercise equipment. She had used it this morning during her routine. "You brought me my shoe," she whispered, "because I checked off the exercise task?" Talon purred loudly. In the enclosure, Ember and Shadow were pressed against the barrier, watching intently. Jiwoo sat down on the floor, her mind racing. This was impossible. The Krath species had been studied for years. They were intelligent, yes. They could solve puzzles and work together to hunt. But understanding symbolic representation, understanding that marks on a screen meant something in the real world, that was a different level of cognition entirely. She looked at Talon, who was still sitting patiently in front of her. Very carefully, she reached out and petted his head. His scales were warm under her hand. He leaned into her touch and purred louder. "Good boy," she said softly. "Very good boy. But we need to test this. I need to be sure." She picked up her datapad and wrote a new item on her list, below all the others. "Give Talon a treat." She wrote it slowly, letting the cubs see every word appear on the screen. Talon watched the screen carefully. When she finished writing, he looked at her expectantly, waiting. Jiwoo stood up and walked to the storage cabinet where she kept the cubs' food. She took out a small piece of dried meat, a special treat they only got once a day. She walked back to Talon and gave it to him. He took it gently from her hand and ate it in 2 bites. Then Jiwoo returned to her datapad and drew a line through "Give Talon a treat." The moment the line appeared, all 3 cubs began purring so loudly that it echoed through the lab. Talon rubbed against her leg like an earth cat. In the enclosure, Ember and Shadow jumped and spun in circles. Jiwoo sat down hard on the floor, her legs suddenly weak. This changed everything. Everything. If the cubs could understand that written words represented real actions, if they could connect symbolic representation to physical reality, then the Krath were far more intelligent than anyone had believed. She looked at the 3 cubs, who were all watching her with what she could only describe as happiness. They understood her lists. They understood completion. They understood the satisfaction of finishing a task. And somehow Jiwoo knew that her life had just become much more complicated. The next morning, Jiwoo woke up earlier than usual. She had barely slept. Her mind kept replaying the moment when Talon brought her the running shoe, the moment when everything she knew about the Krath species turned upside down. She dressed quickly and walked to the lab. The station was quiet at this hour. Most of the other researchers would not be awake for another hour. That was good. She needed time to test her theory without anyone watching, without anyone thinking she had lost her mind. The cubs were still sleeping when she entered the lab. They were curled together in a pile of warm bodies and dark scales, looking almost peaceful. Jiwoo smiled despite her nervousness. They were still young, still innocent. She had to remember that. She sat at her desk and opened her datapad. Her hand shook slightly as she picked up the stylus. This was the real test. Yesterday could have been a coincidence, a lucky guess. But if she was right, if the cubs really understood symbolic representation, then today would prove it. She wrote her first task, Water the plants. Then she waited. Within minutes, the cubs began to stir. Shadow woke first, lifting his dark head and yawning to show rows of sharp white teeth. He blinked at Jiwoo, then looked at her datapad. Immediately, he chirped and nudged Ember awake. Ember woke Talon. Soon all three were pressing against the barrier, watching her with those bright amber eyes. Jiwoo stood up slowly. She walked to the small corner where she kept her 3 plants. They were earth plants, herbs that reminded her of home. She kept a small watering can beside them. She did not pick up the watering can. Instead, she walked back to her desk and sat down. She wanted to see what would happen. For a moment, nothing did. The cubs watched her. She watched them. Then Ember made a decision. The young female Krath pawed at the access door. It was still unlocked from yesterday when Talon had somehow opened it. Jiwoo had left it that way on purpose. She wanted to see if they would use it again. Ember pushed through the door and landed lightly on the lab floor. She looked around, then walked directly to the corner with the plants. She picked up the watering can in her jaws, careful not to puncture it with her teeth. Then she carried it across the lab and dropped it at Jiwoo's feet. Jiwoo stared at the watering can. Her heart was beating fast. This was real. This was actually happening. "Good girl, Ember," she whispered. She picked up the can and walked to the plants. She watered each one slowly, aware that all 3 cubs were watching her every move. When she finished, she returned to her desk and crossed off "Water the plants" on her list. The purring started immediately. All 3 cubs purred so loudly that Jiwoo laughed. Ember looked incredibly pleased with herself, sitting with her tail wrapped around her body like an earth cat. "You understand," Jiwoo said quietly. "You really understand." She helped Ember back into the enclosure, then sat down to think. She needed to document this. She needed to tell someone. But who would believe her? The Krath had been studied for 30 years. If they were capable of understanding symbolic representation, someone would have discovered it by now, unless nobody had ever thought to try, unless nobody had ever shown them something as simple as a to-do list. The lab door opened suddenly. Jiwoo jumped in her seat. Minho, the station commander, walked in carrying a cup of coffee. He was a tall man with tired eyes and gray hair at his temples. He had been running this research station for 5 years. "You are here early," Minho said. He glanced at the cubs. "Everything okay with the subjects?" "Yes," Jiwoo said quickly. "Everything is fine. I just wanted to get a head start on today's work." Minho nodded. He trusted her. She had been a good researcher, careful and thorough. He had no reason to question her. "I need your weekly report by Friday," he said. "Do not forget." "I will not forget," Jiwoo promised. After Minho left, Jiwoo sat very still. Should she tell him? Should she tell anyone? The scientific implications were enormous. If the Krath could understand written language, even at a basic level, it changed everything about how humans should interact with them. It changed everything about how intelligent they were. But she needed more proof, more tests, more data. She looked at her to-do list and wrote a new task. Organize sample containers. The cubs watched her write. She could feel their attention like a physical weight. When she finished, she set down the datapad and went to make herself coffee. She wanted to see if they would act without her prompting them. She poured water into the coffee maker. She measured out the coffee grounds. She pressed the start button. All the while, she could hear small sounds from the lab, clicking, scraping, the soft pad of clawed feet on the metal floor. When she turned around with her coffee cup, she gasped. Shadow had pushed through the access door. He was carrying one of her sample containers in his jaws, walking very carefully so he would not drop it. He placed it on her desk, then looked at her expectantly. "Shadow," Jiwoo breathed. "You brought me a sample container." The young Krath chirped happily. Then he turned and went back through the door. A moment later, he returned with another container, then another. He was organizing them for her, bringing them to her desk one by one so she could arrange them properly. Talon and Ember watched from the enclosure, making soft, encouraging sounds. They could not fit through the access door at the same time, so they were cheering Shadow on from behind the barrier. Jiwoo set down her coffee and knelt beside Shadow. The young Krath looked at her with complete trust. She petted his head gently. His scales were smoother than his siblings, like polished stone. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for helping me." Shadow purred and rubbed against her hand. Then he went to get another container. By the time he finished, Jiwoo had tears in her eyes. The containers were not organized correctly. Shadow did not understand the sorting system she used. But that did not matter. What mattered was that he tried. He understood that she needed the containers. He understood that bringing them to her would help her complete her task. She organized the containers properly, then crossed off the task on her list. The purring from all three cubs was like music. Over the next hour, Jiwoo wrote more tasks. Simple ones at first. Check equipment. Talon brought her a scanner. Review notes. Ember pushed her notebook across the desk with her nose. Eat breakfast. All three cubs sat in front of the food storage and chirped until she came over and got herself a meal bar. Each time she completed a task and crossed it off, the cubs reacted with pure joy. They purred, they chirped, they rubbed against the barrier or against her legs if they were outside the enclosure. It was like they felt the same satisfaction she did when finishing something on her list. By midday, word had spread through the station. Minho came back to the lab with 3 other researchers: Hyejin, the station's engineer, Doyun, the security officer, and Yunji, the psychologist who was supposed to study the human staff, not the alien subjects. They stood in the doorway and watched as Jiwoo wrote "clean desk" on her list. Talon immediately brought her a cloth from the supply shelf. She wiped down her desk, then crossed off the task. The cubs purred. "This is impossible," Hyejin whispered. "The Krath do not have the brain structure for symbolic representation. Every scan we have done shows that their intelligence is tactical, not abstract." "Tell that to them," Jiwoo said. She wrote another task. File reports. Ember pushed a stack of papers across the desk toward the filing cabinet. Minho stepped forward. His face was pale. "How long has this been happening?" "Since yesterday," Jiwoo admitted. "I wrote my morning to-do list like I always do. Talon watched me check off a task, and then he brought me the item associated with that task. I tested it again this morning. They understand. They really understand." Doyun crossed his arms. He was a practical man who did not like surprises. "This could be a security issue. If they are this intelligent, we need to reevaluate our containment protocols." "They are not trying to escape," Jiwoo said firmly. "They are trying to help. There is a difference." Yunji moved closer to the enclosure. She watched the cubs with fascination. "They have bonded with you," she said softly. "In the wild, young Krath learn by watching adult pack members. They learn to hunt by following adults and copying their behavior. These cubs see you as pack. They see your to-do list as pack instructions. They want to participate in pack activities." Jiwoo had not thought of it that way, but it made sense. Perfect sense. The cubs were not performing tricks. They were not trying to please her for treats. They were acting like family members helping with daily tasks. Minho rubbed his face with both hands. "I need to report this to Earth. The scientific community needs to know. This changes everything we understand about the Krath." "I know," Jiwoo said. She looked at the 3 cubs, who were watching all the humans with curiosity. "But please be careful how you report it. I do not want them taken away for more intensive study. They are still babies. They need stability." Minho nodded slowly. I understand. I will be careful. As the other researchers left the lab, talking excitedly among themselves, Jiwoo sat down at her desk. She looked at her to-do list. There was one task left. Submit daily report. She began typing, but her mind was elsewhere. The cubs had learned something amazing, something that should have been impossible, and they had learned it simply by watching her, by wanting to be part of her daily life. She smiled as she wrote. Maybe humans were not the only species who found satisfaction in checking off a to-do list. Maybe that feeling of accomplishment was universal. Maybe it was something that could bridge the gap between species, between worlds, between two completely different ways of thinking. Shadow chirped from the enclosure, and Jiwoo looked up. All three cubs were watching her write her report, waiting to see what task she would give them next, waiting to help their human pack member with whatever she needed. Jiwoo finished her report and crossed off the final task of the day. The cubs purred their approval. And for the first time since arriving on this alien world, Jiwoo felt like she truly belonged. 2 weeks had passed since the discovery. Jiwoo had learned to be very careful with her to-do lists. Every word mattered now. Every task she wrote would be interpreted by 3 intelligent predators who wanted nothing more than to help her complete it. She had learned this the hard way. The first problem came on a Tuesday morning. Jiwoo had been working late the night before, analyzing data from the cubs' behavioral patterns. She was tired. She was not thinking clearly. And she made a mistake that would teach her an important lesson. She sat at her desk with her morning coffee and wrote her personal to-do list, the one she kept separate from her work tasks. It included simple things, personal things, things she did not usually write down because they were just part of life. Eat lunch, she wrote first. That seemed safe enough. Call home, she wrote second. She had not talked to her family on Earth in 2 weeks. The time difference made it hard to coordinate, but she needed to hear her mother's voice. And then, without thinking about it, she wrote the third item, play with cubs. She set down her data pad and went to prepare their morning meal. The cubs were getting bigger now. Talon was nearly twice the size he had been when she first arrived. Ember was developing the reddish tint to her scales that would mark her as a hunter. Shadow was still the smallest, but his intelligence seemed sharpest of all 3. She measured out their food and placed it in the feeding area. All 3 cubs ate eagerly, making happy chirping sounds between bites. When they finished, they groomed each other, using their tongues to clean their faces and scales. It was a peaceful morning scene that Jiwoo had grown to love. Then she returned to her desk to start her work, and that was when everything went wrong. She heard a strange dragging sound behind her. She turned around and froze. Talon was pulling something across the lab floor. Something that moved, something that was alive. It was a 6-legged rodent, one of the native creatures from outside the station. Somehow, Talon had caught it. Or maybe it had wandered into the ventilation system. Either way, the young Krath was very proud of himself. He dropped the struggling creature at Jiwoo's feet and sat back, waiting for her approval. The rodent was not hurt badly, just scared. It tried to run, but Talon pinned it gently with one claw. He chirped at Jiwoo. He looked at her datapad, then back at her. Jiwoo's mind raced. Eat lunch. That was the first task on her list. Talon thought he was helping her eat lunch by bringing her prey. "Oh, no," Jiwoo whispered. "Talon, no. I do not eat those. Humans do not eat those." But Talon did not understand. He pushed the rodent closer to her feet. In the wild, adult Krath would bring prey to their cubs. This was how they taught their young to hunt. But Talon had it backward. He thought he was the adult, bringing food to his pack member. Jiwoo quickly picked up the rodent. It bit her finger, drawing blood, but she held on. She carried it to the airlock and released it outside. When she came back, Talon looked confused. He had worked so hard to catch that prey, Why did his human not want it? Thank you, Talon, Jiwoo said gently. She petted his head. But I will get my own lunch. You do not need to hunt for me. She crossed off. Eat lunch on her list before Talon could bring her anything else. The young Krath purred, but he still looked puzzled. Jiwoo made a mental note. Be specific about food tasks. Very specific. She turned back to her work, thinking the crisis was over. She was wrong. The second problem happened an hour later. Jiwoo was deep in her research when she heard a loud crash. She spun around to see Shadow dragging the communications console across the lab. The heavy equipment scraped across the floor, leaving deep marks in the metal. Shadow, stop! Jiwoo ran toward him, but Shadow was determined. He had read Call Home on her list, and he knew that the communications console was how she talked to people far away, so he was bringing it to her, all of it. The entire console, wires and all. The equipment was expensive, it was delicate, and Shadow was pulling it like it was a toy. Jiwoo grabbed the young Krath and tried to stop him, but he was stronger than she expected. He pulled harder. Sparks flew from the disconnected wires. The lab door burst open. Hyejin ran in, her eyes wide. What is happening? I saw the power fluctuation from engineering. Shadow is trying to help me call home, Jiwoo said, still holding on to the young Krath. He does not understand that he is breaking it. Hyejin quickly disconnected the console from the main power. The sparking stopped. She examined the damage and shook her head. This will take days to repair. Maybe weeks. What were you thinking, letting him do this? I did not let him, Jiwoo said defensively. I wrote it on my list without thinking. They just want to help. Hyejin looked at the three cubs. Talon and Ember had come out of the enclosure and were sitting near Shadow, making worried sounds. They knew something was wrong. They did not understand what. You need to be more careful, Hyejin said firmly. These cubs are getting stronger every day. If they try to help with the wrong task, they could hurt themselves, or hurt you. Jiwoo nodded. She felt terrible. This was her fault. She had not thought about the consequences. She had not considered that the cubs could not understand context or safety. They just wanted to complete the tasks she gave them. She crossed off "Call Home" on her list, even though she had not actually made the call. Then she spent the next hour calming the cubs and helping Hyejin assess the damage to the console. But the worst problem came that afternoon. Jiwoo had almost forgotten about the third task on her list. Play with cubs. It seemed innocent. She played with them every day. It was part of their enrichment, part of their development. What could go wrong? She found out at 3 in the afternoon. She was at her desk, reviewing data, when all three cubs suddenly burst out of their enclosure. The access door flew open with a crash. Talon, Ember, and Shadow came charging across the lab at full speed. They were playing. Or rather, they were doing what young Krath did when they played. They were practicing hunting. Talon pounced on Jiwoo's chair, nearly knocking her to the floor. Ember grabbed a stack of papers in her jaws and shook them violently, shredding them into confetti. Shadow leaped onto a lab table and sent equipment crashing to the ground. "Stop!" Jiwoo shouted. "Stop! Please!" But they did not stop. They thought this was what she wanted. She had written "play with cubs" on her list. This was how cubs played. They wrestled. They pounced. They practiced the skills they would need as adult hunters. Talon tackled Ember, and both of them rolled across the lab floor, knocking over a trash can. Shadow jumped from table to table, his claws leaving scratches in the metal surfaces. They were not being malicious. They were not trying to destroy things. They were just playing the only way they knew how. Jiwoo tried to catch them, but they were too fast. She tried to herd them back to the enclosure, but they thought that was part of the game. They darted around her, chirping happily, their amber eyes bright with excitement. The lab door opened again. This time it was Doyeon, the security officer. His hand went to the tranquilizer gun on his belt. "Doctor, step back. I will handle this." No! Jiwoo put herself between Doyun and the cubs. Do not shoot them. They are just playing. They are not attacking. They are destroying the lab, Doyun said. His voice was calm but firm. I have protocols to follow. Give me a chance, Jiwoo pleaded. Just give me one chance. Doyun hesitated. Then he nodded. One chance, but if you cannot control them, I will sedate them for everyone's safety. Jiwoo turned to the cubs. They had paused their game, sensing the tension in the room. Talon's ears were flattened against his head. Ember was low to the ground, ready to run or fight. Shadow had hidden under a table. Jiwoo walked slowly to her desk. She picked up her data pad with shaking hands, and she drew a line through "Play with cubs." The effect was immediate. All 3 cubs stopped moving. They looked at each other, then at Jiwoo. Slowly, they walked back to their enclosure. Talon went first, his head lowered. Ember and Shadow followed. They climbed through the access door and curled up together in the corner, making soft, sad sounds. They thought they had done something wrong. They thought they had failed their task. Jiwoo's heart broke. She turned to Doyun. You can go. They are calm now. After Doyun left, Jiwoo locked the access door. Then she sat on the floor and put her head in her hands. The lab was a disaster. Papers everywhere. Equipment broken or damaged. Scratches on every surface. And 3 cubs who thought they had disappointed her. Hijin returned an hour later. She looked at the mess and whistled low. That bad, huh? Worse, Jiwoo said. She had not moved from the floor. I did not think. I just wrote down everything I wanted to do, and they tried to help, but they do not understand human context. They do not understand human safety. They just understand that I wrote something, and they want to complete it. Hyejin sat down beside her. You need to talk to Yoonji, the psychologist. She has been studying how the cubs think. Maybe she can help you understand how to communicate with them better. I thought I was communicating well, Jiwoo said miserably. I thought we had figured it out. You figured out that they can understand symbolic representation, Hyejin said gently. But understanding symbols is not the same as understanding meaning. They know that words on your list mean tasks to complete. But they do not know why you wrote those tasks. They do not know what is safe and what is dangerous. They are still babies, Jiwoo. Smart babies, but still babies. Jiwoo looked at the enclosure. The cubs were watching her through the barrier. Their amber eyes were full of worry. They did not understand why their human was sad. They had tried so hard to help. She stood up slowly and walked to the enclosure. She placed her hand against the clear barrier. Talon pressed his head against it from the other side. Ember and Shadow joined him. All 3 cubs were trying to comfort her in the only way they could. I am sorry, Jiwoo whispered. I am sorry I was not clear. I am sorry I did not think about how you would interpret my words. We will figure this out together, I promise. The cubs purred softly. They forgave her. They always forgave her. But Jiwoo knew that everything had to change. She could not just write whatever she wanted on her lists anymore. Every word had to be chosen carefully. Every task had to be specific and safe. The cubs were too intelligent, too eager to help, and too strong to make careless mistakes. She called Yoonji that evening. They talked for 2 hours about pack behavior, about how young predators learned, about the difference between tactical intelligence and abstract understanding. It was exhausting. It was humbling. But it was necessary. The next morning, Jiwoo wrote her first carefully constructed to-do list. Organize papers on desk. Not clean desk, which could mean anything. Check lab equipment visually only. Not check equipment, which might make them try to move things. Prepare food for cubs. Not feed cubs, which they might misinterpret. Every word mattered now. Every task was a message to three intelligent beings who trusted her completely, and Ji-woo was determined not to let them down again. 3 weeks had passed since the lab destruction incident. Ji-woo had become much more careful with her to-do lists. Every task was specific. Every instruction was clear. The cubs had learned, too. They waited for her approval before taking action. They checked with her before moving anything large or potentially dangerous. It was working. Slowly, carefully, they were learning to communicate, to understand each other. It was not perfect, but it was progress. Life at the research station had settled into a new rhythm. The other researchers had accepted that the cubs were different, special. Minho had sent reports to Earth, and the scientific community was in an uproar. Xenobiologists were arguing about brain structure, psychologists were debating the definition of intelligence, and everyone wanted to come study the cubs who could read symbolic representation. But Minho had protected them. He refused to allow anyone else onto the station until the cubs were older, until they were ready for that kind of attention. Ji-woo was grateful for that. On Friday morning, Ji-woo woke up with a strange feeling of happiness. It had been a good week. The cubs were healthy. Her research was going well, and she had not seen her friend Hyejin outside of work in weeks. They both needed a break. She sent a message to Hyejin's quarters. "Want to have brunch tomorrow, 11 a.m. in the lab? I miss talking to you." Hyejin's reply came back quickly. "Yes, I will bring coffee. You bring food. It will be nice." Ji-woo smiled. A simple meal with a friend. Something normal, something human. She needed that. That evening, she sat at her desk and wrote her to-do list for the next day. She had gotten into the habit of writing the entire next day's tasks the night before. It helped her plan better. It helped her think about how the cubs might interpret each item. She wrote her usual tasks first. Morning health check for cubs, water plants, review research notes, prepare weekly report. All safe tasks, all clear tasks. Then, at the bottom, she added, "Brunch with Hyejin, 11 a.m." She read it over twice. It seemed fine. It was a social task, not a lab task. The cubs would not need to help with it. She would just share a meal with her friend in the lab because they both felt comfortable there. Simple. She set down the data pad and went to bed, not knowing that she had just given the cubs their biggest mission yet. The next morning, Ji-woo woke at 9. She took her time getting ready, enjoying the slower pace of the weekend. She dressed in casual clothes instead of her lab uniform. She even put on a little makeup, something she rarely did on the station. When she arrived at the lab at 9:30, she expected to find the cubs still sleeping. They usually slept late on weekends when she was not there early to do morning tasks. Instead, she found the lab empty. The enclosure door was open. All 3 cubs were gone. Ji-woo's heart jumped into her throat. Talon? Ember? Shadow? She looked around frantically. Where could they be? How had they gotten out? The door had been locked. Then she noticed her data pad sitting on the desk, right where she had left it, with her to-do list still displayed on the screen. "Brunch with Hyejin, 11 a.m. "Oh no," Ji-woo whispered. She ran out of the lab and into the corridor. The station was quiet. Most people were still in their quarters, enjoying their day off. She ran toward the cafeteria, hoping that was where the cubs had gone. She found Doyen outside the cafeteria door. The security officer looked confused and worried. "Dr. Ji-woo, I was just coming to find you. Your cubs are in the cafeteria. They are not causing trouble, but they are taking things. Food containers, utensils, a tablecloth. I tried to stop them, but they just chirped at me and kept working." Ji-woo ran past him into the cafeteria. The 3 cubs were there, moving with purpose. Talon was carefully picking up a large thermal food container in his jaws. Ember had somehow gotten a white tablecloth and was dragging it across the floor. Shadow was at the fruit dispensers, using his claws to carefully select fresh fruits and place them in a bag. "What are you 3 doing?" Ji-woo asked, even though she already knew the answer. All three cubs looked at her. They chirped happily. Then they went back to their tasks. Jiwoo heard footsteps behind her. Junho, the botanist who managed the hydroponics bay, came running up. His face was red and he was breathing hard. "Those are my fruits! I grow those for research! How did those creatures get into my bay?" "I am so sorry," Jiwoo said. "They are trying to help me. They saw I had brunch planned and they are gathering supplies." "They broke into a secured area," Junho said angrily. "They could have damaged the plants. They could have contaminated the growing environment. This is not acceptable." Talon chose that moment to walk past them, carrying the thermal container carefully. He did not even look at the angry botanist. He had a mission. He was going to complete it. Jiwoo wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. The cubs were trying so hard, they had understood that brunch meant a meal. They had understood that she needed food for that meal. And they had gone out into the station to get what she needed. They had solved problems, opened doors, made decisions, all to help her complete a task on her list. "I will replace any damaged plants," Jiwoo said to Junho, "and I will make sure this does not happen again. Please, just let me get them back to the lab." Junho grumbled but nodded. He stomped back toward the hydroponics bay, muttering about security protocols and dangerous predators. Jiwoo followed the cubs back to the lab. They moved in a line like a small parade, Talon in front with the food container, Ember in the middle with the tablecloth, Shadow at the back with the bag of fruits. They looked proud of themselves. In the lab, Jiwoo watched in amazement as the cubs set everything up. Talon placed the thermal container on her desk, positioning it carefully. Ember spread the tablecloth on the floor in a clear area, smoothing it out with her nose and paws. Shadow unpacked the fruits and arranged them on the cloth in a neat circle. Then all three cubs sat back and looked at her, waiting for her approval, waiting for her to check off the task so they would know they had done well. Jiwoo sat down on the floor beside the tablecloth. Her eyes were wet with tears. "You did this for me? You did all of this just because I wrote it on my list?" The cubs chirped softly. They moved closer to her, nuzzling against her hands and arms. They could sense that she was emotional, even if they did not fully understand why. The lab door opened. Hyejin walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She stopped and stared at the scene. "What happened here?" "The cubs decided to help with brunch," Jiwoo said, her voice shaking with emotion. "They went out and gathered everything we needed. They even set up a nice space for us to eat." Hyejin set down the coffee and knelt beside the tablecloth. She looked at the cubs with new respect. "They did all this? They understood what brunch meant, what it required." "They understood it was important to me," Jiwoo said. "They understood I wanted to share a meal with you, so they made it possible." Hyejin reached out slowly and petted Ember's head. The young Krath purred and leaned into her hand. "They are not just intelligent," Hyejin said softly. "They care about you. They want to make you happy." Footsteps in the corridor announced more visitors. Minho appeared in the doorway, followed by Yoonji and Do-yoon. They must have heard about the cubs' adventure through the station. Minho looked at the setup on the floor, at the cubs sitting proudly beside their work, at Jiwoo and Hyejin preparing to have their meal on a tablecloth on the lab floor. He shook his head slowly. "I should be angry," Minho said. "They broke into the hydroponics bay. They took supplies from the cafeteria. They moved through the station unsupervised. This violates every safety protocol we have." "I know," Jiwoo said. "And I take full responsibility. I should have been more careful with what I wrote on my list." "But," Minho continued, holding up a hand, "I am also amazed. They planned this. They worked together. They solved problems. They understood not just what you needed, but why you needed it. They understood that sharing a meal is a social activity." that it requires preparation, that it is important to you. Yunji stepped forward, her eyes bright with scientific curiosity. This is a major cognitive leap. They are not just responding to tasks anymore. They are understanding context. They are understanding human social rituals. This changes everything we know about how intelligence develops in non-human species. Doyen crossed his arms. He still looked worried. They are also getting stronger and more independent every day. What happens when they are fully grown? What happens when they weigh 300 pounds each and can tear through steel? If they decide to help with a task and do not understand the danger, they could hurt someone. The lab fell silent. It was a good question. A scary question. The cubs were growing fast. Soon, they would not be cubs anymore. They would be adult Krath, powerful, dangerous, still intelligent, still eager to help, but much harder to control. Jiwoo looked at the three cubs. Talon was watching her face, his amber eyes full of concern. Ember had moved closer, pressing against Jiwoo's side. Shadow had placed one paw on her knee, a gesture of comfort. "We will figure it out," Jiwoo said firmly. "We have to, because they are not just research subjects anymore. They are individuals. They have thoughts and feelings and desires. They want to be part of something. They want to help. We cannot punish them for that. We have to teach them, guide them, help them understand the world they are living in." Minho nodded slowly. "You are right. But we need better containment, better protocols, and we need to start thinking about their future." "What happens to them when your research assignment ends? Where will they go?" It was another question Jiwoo did not want to think about. She had 8 more months on this station. Then she was supposed to return to Earth, write her papers, present her findings. But what about the cubs? Could they be moved to another facility? Would they understand if she left? Would they feel abandoned? "We have time to figure that out," Jiwoo said, not sure if she was trying to convince Minho or herself. Hyejin handed Jiwoo one of the coffee cups. "Right now we have brunch to eat. The cubs worked very hard to set this up. We should not let their effort go to waste." Jiwoo smiled gratefully. Hyejin always knew how to lighten the mood. "You are right. Everyone is welcome to join us. We have plenty of food." And so, in a research lab on an alien world, 6 humans and 3 predator cubs shared a meal on a tablecloth on the floor. They ate fruits from the hydroponics bay and food from the thermal container. They drank coffee and talked about science and life and the strange bond that had formed between species. The cubs purred contentedly, happy that their task had been successful, happy that their human was happy. When the meal was over, Jiwoo picked up her data pad. She drew a line through Brunch with Hyejin, 11 a.m. The cubs erupted in purrs so loud that everyone laughed. Talon rubbed his head against Jiwoo's arm. Ember did a little spin of joy. Shadow chirped and pranced around the tablecloth. "They really do love completing tasks," Yunji said, shaking her head in wonder. "It gives them genuine pleasure." "Maybe that is something all intelligent beings share," Hyejin said thoughtfully. "The satisfaction of finishing what we start, the joy of helping others, the pride of a job well done." Jiwoo hugged all 3 cubs, breathing in their strange, warm scent. They smelled like stone and heat and something else, something that reminded her of home, even though they were nothing like anything on Earth. "Thank you," she whispered to them. "Thank you for caring so much." Later that evening, after everyone had left and the cubs were asleep in their enclosure, Jiwoo sat at her desk and added a note to her research journal. "The cubs do not just understand tasks. They understand ritual. They understand significance. They know that some tasks are more important than others. And they dedicate themselves completely to helping with those tasks. This is not just intelligence. This is empathy. This is love." She looked at the 3 sleeping forms curled together in the enclosure, and she wondered how she would ever be able to leave them. 4 months had passed since the brunch incident. Summer had turned to autumn on Krathvar, though the purple sky looked much the same. The 3 moons traced different paths now, and the air had a sharper bite to it when the station's outer doors opened. The cubs were not cubs anymore. Talon stood nearly 5 feet tall at the shoulder, his black scales thick and gleaming. Ember had grown into her reddish coloring, looking like a creature made of dark fire. Shadow was still the smallest, but his intelligence had only sharpened with age. His amber eyes seemed to see everything, understand everything. But they still loved Jiwoo's to-do lists. The relationship had evolved, though. In those 4 months of living together, of learning together, both Human and Krath had refined their communication. Jiwoo had learned to write with precision. The cubs had learned to interpret with wisdom. When Jiwoo wrote inventory, they no longer brought her every single item in the lab. They brought her the datapad she used for inventory tracking, and then waited for further instructions. When she wrote exercise, they did not bring her shoes. They simply positioned themselves by the door, ready to accompany her on her morning run around the station corridors. They had become her partners, not just her helpers. The station had changed, too. The enclosure was gone. Minho had agreed that it was pointless. The cubs could open any door they wanted. They had proven that dozens of times. Instead, one corner of the lab had been designated as their space, with soft bedding and their enrichment toys. They came and went as they pleased, though they rarely left Jiwoo's side. The other researchers had grown used to seeing 3 massive predators walking through the corridors. Hyejin would stop to pet Ember when they crossed paths. Junho had forgiven Shadow for the fruit incident, and now sometimes brought him treats. Even Doyun, the cautious security officer, had admitted that the cubs were safer than some of the human staff. But the biggest change was in how the cubs understood the world. One particularly long day, Jiwoo had been working for 14 hours straight. She was exhausted. Her eyes burned from staring at screens. Her back ached from sitting too long. She had 3 reports due, 2 experiments to analyze, and a presentation to prepare for the visiting research team that would arrive next month. She made herself a cup of tea and sat down at her desk. She looked at her to-do list. It was long, too long. She would never finish everything today, maybe not even this week. She added one more item at the bottom: rest. Then she stared at it. She did not remember the last time she had written that word on her list. Rest was something she did when everything else was done. But everything was never done. There was always more work, always more data to analyze, always more reports to write. The 3 Krath had been lying in their corner, dozing. But the moment Jiwoo wrote rest, all 3 heads lifted. They looked at each other. Then they looked at her. They stood up and walked across the lab. Talon gently took the datapad from her hands with his teeth. He set it on the far side of the desk, out of her reach. Ember nosed the keyboard, pushing it away. Shadow placed his large body between Jiwoo and her computer screens. Then all 3 of them lay down around her workspace. Talon on her left, Ember on her right. Shadow in front, facing the door. They created a circle of warm bodies and protective presence. They purred softly, a deep rumbling sound that Jiwoo felt in her chest. "You want me to rest," she said softly. "Right now. You are not bringing me things to help me rest. You are making me rest." Talon opened one amber eye and looked at her. Then he closed it again and purred louder. Jiwoo felt tears on her cheeks. They understood. They really understood. This was not about completing a task. This was about taking care of someone they loved. They knew she was tired. They knew she needed to stop working. And they were doing what pack members did. They were protecting her, even from herself. She reached out and placed one hand on Talon's head, one on Ember's back. Shadow pressed his nose against her knee. She sat there in the circle of their warmth and presence, and for the first time in weeks, she let herself truly rest. She must have fallen asleep. When she woke, it was dark outside. The lab lights had dimmed to night mode. The three Krath were still surrounding her, still keeping watch. They had not moved in hours, just to make sure she could sleep safely. Jiwoo picked up her datapad with shaking hands. She crossed off rest. The purring that erupted was soft this time, gentle, like they knew she needed quiet, like they understood that this task was different from all the others. This task was about her well-being, not just her productivity. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for knowing what I needed." Word of the incident spread through the station, as everything did in such a small community. Yoonji came to visit the next day. She sat in the lab and watched the cubs for a long time before speaking. "They are not following commands anymore," Yoonji said finally. "They are making judgments. They saw you write rest, and they decided that meant you needed to stop working immediately. They interpreted the task based on context and your physical state. That is abstract reasoning at a very high level." "They are smart," Jiwoo said simply. "They are more than smart," Yoonji replied. "They care. They have emotional investment in your well-being. That is not just intelligence, that is empathy, that is love." It was the same word Jiwoo had written in her journal months ago. Love. It seemed impossible. Humans and Krath had evolved on different worlds, under different suns. Their brains were structured differently. Their societies operated on different principles. But somehow, in this lab, on this station, a bond had formed that transcended all of those differences. 2 weeks later, a ship arrived from Earth. It carried Sunho, a renowned xenopsychologist who had spent his career studying intelligence in non-human species. He had read all of Jiwoo's reports. He had watched all of her videos, and he had come to see the cubs for himself. Jiwoo was nervous as she introduced him to the Krath. Sunho was famous. His opinions could make or break theories. His papers were cited in every major journal. If he decided the cubs were just performing learned behaviors, that they were not really understanding symbolic representation, it would undermine everything she had discovered. But Sunho did not do experiments right away. He simply sat in the lab and observed. He watched Jiwoo write her morning list. He watched the cubs respond to each task. He took notes, but he did not interfere. On the third day, he asked Jiwoo a question. "What happens if you write a task you cannot complete?" Jiwoo had never thought about that. "I do not know. I always complete my tasks, or I cross them off if they become impossible." "Try it," Sunho suggested. "Write something you cannot do, something they cannot help you do. See how they react." That afternoon, Jiwoo wrote a new task. Fly to the nearest moon. It was impossible, obviously. The station had no personal spacecraft. There was no way to complete that task. She set down the datapad and waited. The three Krath gathered around the datapad. They looked at the words. Then they looked at each other. Talon made a low questioning sound. Ember tilted her head. Shadow paced back and forth, clearly thinking. They knew something was wrong. They could tell this task was different from all the others. But they did not know how to help. After several minutes, Shadow approached Jiwoo. He gently pushed her hand toward the datapad with his nose. When she picked it up, he pawed at the screen where the task was written. Then he looked at her with those intelligent amber eyes. "You want me to delete it?" Jiwoo asked. Shadow chirped and nodded his head. An unmistakable gesture. Yes. Jiwoo deleted the task. All three Krath relaxed immediately. They returned to their corner, satisfied that the impossible burden had been removed from their humans list. Sunho wrote frantically in his notebook. "They understand impossibility. They understand when a task is beyond completion, and they communicated to you that you should remove it. That is problem-solving at a level we have never seen in a non-human species." Over the next 2 weeks, Sunho conducted dozens of tests. He wrote tasks in different languages. The cubs learned to recognize the patterns. He wrote ambiguous tasks. The cubs asked for clarification, using body language and sounds that Jiwoo had learned to interpret. He wrote tasks with moral implications. The cubs hesitated, seeming to weigh the right course of action before proceeding. At the end of his visit, Sunho sat with Jiwoo in the station's common area. The cubs were with them, as they always were. Shadow had his head in Jiwoo's lap. Talon and Ember were playing a gentle game of tug with a rope. "You have discovered something revolutionary," Sunho said. "These cubs have bonded with you through task completion. In the wild, young Krath learn by following adults in coordinated pack hunting. They learn to move together, work together, achieve goals together. You accidentally triggered that same learning pattern, but channeled it into a completely different direction. Instead of hunting, they hunt completion. Instead of prey, they pursue your satisfaction." "So it is just instinct?" Jiwoo asked, feeling oddly disappointed. "No," Sunho said firmly. "Instinct is the foundation. But they have built something far beyond instinct. They have created a communication system. They have developed abstract reasoning. They have formed emotional bonds. That is not programmed behavior. That is genuine intelligence and genuine emotion working together." He paused, watching Ember gently release the rope so Talon could win the game. "The galactic community has always divided species into categories: sentient and non-sentient, intelligent and non-intelligent. But these cubs prove that intelligence is not binary. It is a spectrum, and on that spectrum, they have climbed higher than we ever thought possible for their species." "What does this mean for them?" Jiwoo asked. "For all Krath? It means we need to completely reconsider how we interact with them. If they are capable of this level of understanding, then we have been underestimating them for decades. It means there might be ways to communicate with adult Krath, ways to coexist that we never considered." Jiwoo felt a surge of hope. "They could be partners? Not just subjects?" "Perhaps," Sunho said carefully. "But it will take time. These 3 cubs are special because they bonded with you so young. Adult Krath have different experiences, different learned behaviors, but you have proven it is possible, and that changes everything." The day Sunho left, Jiwoo sat at her desk and looked at her to-do list. Her research assignment was ending in 4 months. She would have to leave Krathvar, leave the station, leave the cubs. She had been avoiding thinking about it, avoiding planning for it, but it was time. She wrote one final task, the one she had been dreading: say goodbye to cubs. Immediately, all 3 Krath reacted. Talon rushed to her side. Ember made a distressed sound. Shadow went to his toy box and started bringing her things: his favorite ball, his puzzle toy, the soft blanket he slept with. They understood the word goodbye. They understood what it meant, and they were refusing to let it happen. Jiwoo started crying. "I do not want to leave you, but I have to. My job here is ending. I have to go back to Earth." Shadow dropped his blanket and climbed into her lap, even though he was far too big for it now. Ember pressed against her side. Talon placed his head on her desk, covering the datapad where the terrible task was written. They would not let her check it off. They would not let her complete this task. This was one thing they could not help her with. This was one thing they would fight against with everything they had. Jiwoo held them close and made a decision. She opened her communication console and sent a message to Minho, then another to Sunho, then another to the Research Council back on Earth. The messages all said the same thing. "I am requesting an extension of my assignment, indefinitely. I cannot leave my research subjects. They have become too important to my work." It was not the whole truth. The truth was that they had become family. The truth was that she could not imagine her life without them. The truth was that she had discovered something more important than any research paper or career advancement. She had discovered connection, understanding, love across species. 3 days later, Minho came to her lab with a message from Earth. They had approved her extension, not indefinitely, but for 2 more years. Time to continue her research. Time to document everything. Time to teach other researchers how to communicate with the cubs. And time to figure out what would happen when the cubs became full adults, when they were too large and powerful to live on a human station, when they would need to return to their own kind. But that was a problem for the future. Right now, Ji-woo had 2 more years, and she was going to make every day count. She picked up her datapad and looked at the task she had written. Say goodbye to cubs. She deleted it completely. It disappeared from her list as if it had never been there. Shadow saw what she had done. He chirped happily. Talon purred so loudly that the desk vibrated. Ember did her spinning dance of joy. No goodbyes, Ji-woo said firmly. Not today. Not yet. We have too much work to do together. She wrote a new list, new tasks, new goals, new research to conduct. And at the bottom, she added one special item. Teach others what the cubs have taught me. Because that was the real gift these 3 Krath had given her. They had taught her that intelligence took many forms, that communication could happen without shared language, that bonds could form across impossible divides, that love was universal, transcending species and worlds and evolution, and that sometimes the most important task on your list was not about productivity or achievement. It was about connection, about being present, about caring for those who cared for you. The cubs gathered around her as she worked, keeping their usual watch. Talon on her left, Ember on her right, Shadow at her feet. Their purring filled the lab like a gentle song. Ji-woo smiled and began writing her research paper. It would be the most important paper of her career, not because of the scientific data, though that was groundbreaking, but because it would tell a story, the story of a human and 3 predators who found a way to understand each other, the story of a to-do list that changed everything. Years later, when Ji-woo was old and famous and had changed the way humans thought about alien intelligence, she would keep one thing from her time on Krathvar, not her research awards, not her published papers, not even the recordings of her groundbreaking experiments. She kept her old datapad, and on it, saved in a protected file, was a simple to-do list. The very first one that Talon had seen her check off, the one that started everything. Morning exercise, with a single line drawn through it, and a note underneath, written years later. The day 3 cubs taught me what it means to connect across the impossible distance between species. The day I learned that some tasks are worth a lifetime to complete.